to fail in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Speaker.
I call Mark Patterson.
I'm very humbled, actually, Madam Speaker, to get up and speak on behalf of New Zealand First on this Farm Debt Mediation Bill number 2. This bill has a long genesis. It goes back to a private member's bill by Doug Woollerton in 1999. It was also part of a bill. It was a bill under the Honourable Ron Mark in 2015, and more latterly under my name in a previous iteration as a private member's bill. How grudging and disappointing it is to see the grudging acceptance of this bill by the National Party. This is a thoroughly sensible and well-needed measure, particularly in this time, and how disappointing. A party that used to purport to stand up for the regions, playing cheap, petty politics. While this bill may have come forward as private member's bill, it was actually of such importance and magnitude that it did deserve the full weight of MPI official support and the wider consultation that a bill of this consequence should have behind it. So I condemn the National Party actually for their grudging position on this bill. We have been championing this measure for 20 years. They are grudgingly there now and dragging their heels, and they should have a good look in the mirror if they want to purport to champion the farming sector. So in that light, I would like to thank the Minister, Damien O'Connor, for bringing this bill forward and giving it the resourcing that it needs to make it the bill an effective measure for a formal mediation process for farmers. Farming is an inherently risky business. Much of the success of an individual farmer comes down to a number of measures that are beyond their control, no matter how competent they are as an individual operator. There is climate risk, there is commodity price risk. We've seen some major outbreaks, biosecurity outbreaks that seem to be a constant presence. We've seen the Bovis outbreak, of course, recently, and not long before that, a major the PSA outbreak in the kiwi fruit industry. We have a fruit fly outbreak incursion at the moment that we're dealing with. There is risks everywhere. We have got Trump and China going head-to-head in a trade war that throws currencies about and export markets. So there is a lot of things outside farmers' control. And at a macro level, the $63 billion worth of debt has been identified by the Reserve Bank as a systematic risk to the New Zealand economy. On top of that, we have a banking sector that is in a managed pullback. I think it's a very not a well-kept secret. There is a pullback from the Australian banks in particular, some of it related to the banking inquiry over there, where their banks are just pulling their credit, rationing their credit. And when you've got $63 billion worth of credit, and that credit is held in a relatively small number of hands, and only 20% of farmers carry almost all the debt, or the vast majority of debt. So it is a systematic risk. And of course, farming supports 350,000 workers, and of course much more across the wider economy. If you spread that out, of course, have $46 billion of exports. And listening to the opposition speakers, you would think that agriculture was in dire straits. In fact, we have record exports at the moment at $46 billion and growing. So at a macro level, this is a risk, but at a personal level, when farmers do get into trouble, there is a significant power imbalance. The banks literally hold the purse strings, and the farmers' resources to have a fair process is somewhat limited. And those processes tend to be at the end of this, while things have got to a point where they're past the point of no return. The absolute aim of this bill is to have the fence at the top of the cliff. This is not, as Mr Bennett seemed to infer, designed to rescue people that have made poor commercial decisions or are, in fact, in an insolvent position. This is not to do that at all. This is to put a circuit breaker in place that either party can call in so that before we get to that stage, there is a chance to have a fair, balanced discussion about the direction of the farming business before it gets to the point of no return. And so some good decisions can be made. And I know that farmers are so connected to their land. It is so deeply ingrained in their psyche, and many of these businesses are multi-generational. They will do almost anything to maintain their farm, and particularly a family farm. And it's about, actually, sometimes it'll be saving them from themselves. So it is not designed to mitigate commercial failure. It will give the opportunity for a managed retreat or an exit with dignity. It also will put some oversight onto the sector and lending practices. And I know since having the private members bill, I've become a bit of a lightning rod in our office. Michael Halliday up there, who I commend for having done a lot of work on the private members bill. We have been inundated by farmers coming to us with their issues. We have two cases at the moment in front of the Serious Fraud Office, because what there is while you have a first-tier level of bankers who are broadly speaking responsible, you have behind that some vulture second and third tier lenders that are circling, and farmers desperate to hold on to their farm will sign almost any piece of documentation to hold their farm, and they will dig deeper and deeper into debt. And that's what we've seen, and we've seen some shoddy behaviour, and the SFO will sort that out and have some justice there, hopefully, for the farmers that we are representing there. So the other thing about this that I think is really important is that loans are secured against farmland, of course, but farm machinery, crops, livestock, wool, agriculture. We have to, in the select committee, I think, nail that down. I've had beekeepers come to me. Are bees livestock? I would argue that they are, and I would hope that they will be incorporated. But particularly, as Kiri Tapu Allen outlined in her contribution, the share milkers, who are such an important part of our biggest industry, the dairy industry, and they are particularly vulnerable. And in this banking pullback that we're seeing at the moment, they are the ones that are first to feel the squeeze. And as Richard McIntyre, the chair of the Federated Farmers Share Milker section, said, this is a much-needed piece of legislation. I hope the National Party were listening to Richard. I hope they were listening to Andrew Hoggard, the Deputy Chairman or President of Federated Farmers, who also endorsed this bill. I hope they were listening to Rural Women New Zealand, Fiona Gower, who said this was a much-needed piece of legislation. I hope they have taken notice of the Hayne Royal Commission in Australia into their banking sector that commended the New South Wales legislation for which this is based, and recommended that the other states in Australia pick this up. Such had been the success of that piece of legislation in New South Wales. This will put some independent mediators in place. There is good provisions in there to make sure the allocation of these independent mediators is done fairly, so that it's at the agreement of both parties. And again, that's putting that power imbalance, that's taking away that power imbalance, it's having equal parties sitting at the table and having a balanced discussion. So New Zealand First absolutely have absolute pleasure actually in bringing this bill. We have fought long and hard for this measure to come forward. We have been stymied at every hurdle along the way, and there's some parties opposite that need to look in the mirror as to why they would have done that when this is such a sensible piece of legislation. So New Zealand First and myself having the honour actually of commending this bill to the House. Thank you.
Michael Stewart-Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, I'm a little bit